This is the French History Debating Society. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. I welcome Germanicus, Michael Vlahos. We're in Londinium, where we live happily, first century AD. We are by the Thames with a cup of wine, philosophizing about all the centuries between now and where there's a wall we can't get through. Somewhere in the 21st century, we can't see past it. Some limitation. We're Equus class. We don't work. We have Greeks working for us on our estates. We're surrounded by retired centurions and their families, very happy people. Centurions did 25 years in the Legion. They tell wonderful stories, and they're quite available and friendly. And we are reflecting, have been for quite some time, about the quandary in the 21st century for the inheritor of the Roman Empire. That would be the American Empire. A reluctant empire, yes. However, the burden sits heavily on its shoulders now. It's in an election cycle. And Germanicus and I have been observing that cycle in terms of our era, what we know to be the way the Julian-Claudian family finally failed, what we know to be the legends of Caesar, the origins of the empire. We are happy with our empire, Rome. We know a century ahead of us is a good time. After that, it gets a little dodgy. Germanicus, last time we had this conversation, we spoke of Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, who was a principal in two dramas that came to create Augustus. The first drama was with Caesar when he conquered Egypt and took her as a wife. And the second drama was when Cleopatra teamed with Mark Antony, who wanted to inherit Caesar's mantle, but he was opposed by Octavian, who was no warrior, a very clever politician, and though a young man, and Caesar's adopted son, who also had Marcus Agrippa, the great admiral, who won the Battle of Actium when Cleopatra fled and Mark Antony abandoned his fleet and chased after her. Octavian and Marcus Agrippa and the Roman army go on to Egypt, conquer Mark Antony. He's dead. And Cleopatra commits suicide rather than submit herself to Octavian and be paraded in a triumph in Rome. She goes out a queen. And 2,000 years later, we know that America and Europe still honor Cleopatra. The American canvas now includes a very powerful woman, the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris from California, very secure in her base politics. She comes from San Francisco, highly approved in Sacramento, was Attorney General of California for a number of years, Vice President for the last 4, loyally served Joe Biden, who stepped aside. We've talked to him of Tiberius. All that is behind us. Right now is the campaign that Cleopatra, Kamala Harris, is running against a man who at times can remind us of Caesar. He can also remind us of, I don't know, any one of Caesar's rivals on his way up, any one of them, but also can resemble a barbarian when he wants to. It's quite unpredictable. So setting aside the Roman model, how do you see the American canvas right now between Harris representing the elite coastals and Trump, surprisingly, representing the flyover country, the American working class? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. Mr. Trump has carefully cultivated and groomed his position as a charismatic leader, going all the way back to the time he spent seen as clownish by many among the elite, engaged in WWF wrestling matches. And I think he developed a deep understanding of all of the Americans who feel left behind and, in a sense, betrayed by the coastal elites. And he was able to appeal to them so powerfully and in a way that was so startling and unexpected by the elites, including the old red Republican establishment, that they were unable to effectively halt his passage. And the events of just the recent weeks, when the old emperor, Mr. Biden, was shown to be so infirm and lost almost instantly all authority and even legitimacy, followed shortly by the attempted assassination of Mr. Trump. All of these things put the blue elites, the ruling elites, in a position where defeat looked certain to them. And so they responded with real nimbleness, I think, and alacrity in taking the movement that Mr. Trump had created and creating a kind of mirror simulacrum of a populist movement for the new emperor in waiting, Ms. Harris. And they did so by essentially creating an acclamation narrative, which again is very Roman, because of course, on the accession of a Roman emperor, and this was for 1,500 years, at the accession of the emperor, he had to be acclaimed by the Roman Senate and the people of Rome. And essentially that model is being marshaled today through media, social media, and the narrative spinners to make it seem as though there is a counter-populist surge behind Ms. Harris, and that this is essentially the perfect counter wave, as it were, to the flyover red populist movement of Mr. Trump. And yet it is it's extremely brittle because it is invented and it is artificial. It doesn't have the authenticity of Mr. Trump's movement, which has endured. And the fact that he could stoke it and ride to another nomination on the strength of it, even out of office, is a kind of real testament to the power of the vision that he brings to those who feel dispossessed and, as I said, left behind.
The validation of the assassination attempt. You will recall that in Miami, there was an attempt to assassinate FDR right after when he was first on the national stage.
Right.
I believe the mayor of Miami was shot instead and died afterwards. And it gave the young governor from New York a validation that he hadn't had before that attempt. Even despite the polio, despite the fact that he was gentry, despite his reputation as a poor lawyer but a great politician in Albany, all of that, the assassination validated in some fashion that this is chosen by fate.
Right.
I have not seen that about Trump since the assassination. Have you? Maybe it's there, but it hasn't come up again.
A difficulty in doing a kind of whole overarching analysis of the spirit of the moment, the zeitgeist that we inhabit today, is that the visible presentation is so owned by one side. So the mainstream media and much of social media is simply not going to allow that myth, that notion of the chosen one. Could he be the one? You know, and you see this in so many movies like Dune and others, The Matrix.
Right.
They want to keep that dead and buried, but just looking at the Trump side of Twitter, there is a powerful sensibility under the surface. And of course, back in the day, more than 50 years ago, Richard Nixon called these people the silent majority. Today, it's called flyover country, or, the deplorables. And they do not have a real presence in the visible media ether. And yet there is a big feeling below the surface. And you can see lots of glimmers of it on Twitter. And I'm convinced this is bigger than anyone wants to admit to among the blue ruling class.
I think of an image that Selena Zito gave me once, not this campaign, several campaigns ago, about the opinion in America that's not online. It was a little town in Pennsylvania, and she was interviewing, and a woman on a porch said, "Come sit a spell and tell me a story, dear." There, Michael. There is that silent majority right there.
Yes, that's right. And, Celino has really caught this feeling and this spirit in the several pieces she did in the immediate aftermath of the assassination attempt. And it's very powerful writing. It's really great journalism. And it brings to a kind of clarity the feelings that Americans have and the impact that this moment had on all the people who supported him and others who saw him as a clown and a fool and now see gravitas in him. They may not want to vote for him. They still may think he's vulgar and unreliable and everything that makes them turn their nose up, and yet they cannot deny anymore this gravitas. And so the extension, if you will, of the penumbra of Trump's gravitas is a very powerful thing, and it's going to have a quiet, perhaps even hidden, but very powerful impact on the election outcome.
Let's go to international affairs. Gaius, John Batchelor, Germanicus, Mark Antony, Londinium, reflecting on the campaign, but there are headlines now that can't wait. War warning in Lebanon. The U.S. and Russia both simultaneously have urged their citizens to leave Lebanon. The British did that several days past. At the same time, Iran is threatening a barrage as soon as the morrow. Hezbollah has fired 50 missiles at least, now the reporting from Jerusalem. 50 missiles into Upper Galilee, northern Israel. The expectation is that a war is imminent on the basis of the vows made by the Ayatollah over the corpse of a Hamas killer and by the General Secretary of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, over the corpse of a killer, that they will revenge. I believe Nasrallah was colorful. He said, Israel will weep, whereas the Ayatollah was straight up, vow, I will get. What is interesting, of course, is how does this affect the American empire, given that we're not directly involved in war fighting? But after 10, 11 months of Gaza, the American public is going to be very stumped how to regard this. And it might not be possible for President Biden to explain it, which ordinarily you would expect from the Oval Office and 9 o'clock address, why we're continuing to be the backup to Israel. We have fleets moving around in the Red Sea, and the Arabian Sea. We have our ambassadors in Beirut. We have lots of conversations back channel with Iran. Iran is allied with Russia. So the American people are going to want to know what's our part of this? How does this connect to Gaza? Now, Germanicus, we know how it does. So the single question here is it required for the president to explain it? Is it required for the candidates in the campaign to explain it? Or is this war just going to take place like there's street fighting in Dhaka now, the capital of Bangladesh, and it's not making the evening news? Is that how this is going to go forward?
No, it won't be like Dhaka. I mean, there was a war raging in Congo for over 10 years in the early part of this century, the first decade, and 10 million Congolese died. And I talked to the UN general, a Dutchman, at some length. He led the largest UN army in the field, 17,000 soldiers, trying to be a peacekeeping force. And no one in the United States knew that that war was happening, knew how many had died. It was all done. And it's not the same with Israel, because Israel is front and center on the news. And it's now become an extra element of discord and disunion in the United States. And so a war between Israel and Hezbollah, and as well as Hamas, the Houthi, and Iran, will ensnare the US. And the whole approach the Biden administration has taken has been to avoid explaining anything except to reiterate, along with the loyal red establishment types, we're with Israel 100%. And the truth is that we're more than 100% with Israel. And in fact, we are more engaged in the Israeli struggle with the ring of Arabs and Iranians surrounding them than we are in Ukraine. And in fact, the Iranian strike on Israel recently involved U.S. forces engaging Iranian missiles. And the U.S. has been shooting down Houthi drones and missiles. So we are, in a sense, at war with two of the actors. It's not recognized as such either by the Iranians or by us, but at some point, very easily and very quickly, we could be engaged in much more than just shooting down a few drones and missiles. Furthermore, all of the weapons that Israel has used to bombard Gaza have been given to Israel, that is to say, shells plus many, many bombs, a lot of ordnance. It's all from us. And we've been engaged. We've had special forces involved, and we had the Navy and Coast Guard and Army involved in this abortive attempt to create an artificial harbor. None of this has gone unnoticed by the world, and what it means is that we're just even closer in the case of Israel to engaging a major power in direct combat than we are even in Ukraine, where both Russia and NATO have been careful the whole time not to get in direct engagement. In the line of fire, yes, and hundreds of, maybe thousands of NATO troops have died in Ukraine, many of them, most of them Poles, but Americans have died in Ukraine, American soldiers, American contractors, French have, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a point very close to becoming real war. And at that point, I would expect the US to continue to do what it's been doing, and that is try and obfuscate and disguise and cloak and otherwise misdirect Americans from what is actually happening. But there comes a point where that can no longer happen. If
There'll be immediately an emergency meeting at the UN, a call for a ceasefire.
right.
Negotiations will go on overnight. That won't change the trajectory of the war. There'll be large body counts, claimed or real, we can't tell. And this is not a war that will end any time before 25.
No.
On.
Well, we have lots of soldiers in Syria and Iraq, and they will be attacked.
Right.
Sure. So we're going to get more
about a potential of the famous widening war, the wider war.
Yes.
And so the simple question, does Tiberius address the nation, or does he let his lieutenants handle it? That'd be fine. Mr. Austin and Mr. Blinken have handled Gaza. And because Tiberius Biden is lame, is the expectation much lower than it would be if he was running for re-election or if there was no election. And does this affect the other thing that we were talking about? Just a minute, Michael. Does it affect Harris-Trump, or are they floating above all this? We have a minute.
It will affect the election between Mr. Harris and Ms. Harris and Mr. Trump, because if Tiberius is seen to be the actual leader, and that, of course, would suggest that he would make an address to the nation, then that takes away from the authority of Ms. Harris, and she is still the person in waiting and not the person making decisions. That might or might not be good, depending on how the war is weakening confidence in the Democrats with the election. So you have two wars, and Americans don't like the idea of another real war where Americans are dying on battlefields. And so that could really hurt the administration. And under those circumstances, they might want to try and just hang as much of it on Mr. Biden, Tiberius, as possible. But on the other hand, Ms. Harris looks more insubstantial because there is another emperor who's still in
let's go to the fifth emperor.
titular command.
Germanicus is here. I'm Gaius. This is Londinium. And we're picking our way through what you'd have to say is fog of war warning. There's no time to go back and talk about the assassination or the email retirement of the president, all spectacular events that in the future historians will go, yeah, it really happened. Yeah, just like that. However, we're now looking at something from our time, the year of 4 emperors, when Nero committed suicide because he was certain they were going to torture him to death. The Senate, I mean. There were, in succession, a series of generals, legates, who tried to claim the throne. Eventually, the winner was Vespasian, who hadn't tried to claim, but he had surrogates who did. And he was rewarded with the empire. And his son and his 2 sons inherited from him. We have one of his sons now, Domitian, very unpopular. However, we're speaking to the year of 5 emperors in 2024. Biden is obvious. Harris is obvious. Trump is obvious. Vance of Ohio is obvious. The 5th emperor, we don't have it yet. We expect to have it this week. And there are 3 possibilities, maybe more, but the 3 are named. 1 from the Southwest, Kelly. 2 from the upper Midwest, Walt. And 3 from the Mid-Atlantic, Shapiro. Each of these regions are vital in their own way for the Electoral College and for the argument for the candidacy. Trump committed himself to a red state, young, very young senator, Millennium. Kelly is an astronaut. Walz is a man of the people. And Shapiro is a rising star in the Democratic Party. So the choice is not easy. Each of these candidates represents different parts of the Democratic Party's ambitions. Germanicus, we're not flipping coins. We recognize all 3 have their strengths, and they'll be on the campaign trail. Whichever is vice president, the others will campaign. It makes the Democratic Party look like it has a wing that isn't much represented in Washington headlines. The progressives don't make room for these 3 men. But there they are. One of them is going to be on the ticket. That sounds like a good thing. How do you hear it, Germanicus? We have a few minutes.
One of the aspects of the year of the 4 emperors, our year of the 4 emperors, 69, was that the ability of the contenders or candidates to ingratiate critical political factions was the key to their success or lack of it. And Galba blew it right away by failing to favor and offer the proper gifts to the right people. He was succeeded by Vitellius, who actually was very good at ingratiating himself, but was overthrown by Otho, who happened to have the legions of the Rhine. Now, all of the contenders, Galba, Vitellius, Otho, and Vespasian, were all generals, legates, and they had armies that supported them. And in many ways, the vice presidential stakes are similar. Each of the candidates brings with him his own army. And the army is it's uncertain. I mean, at first, when Otho defeated Vitellius, he had the legions of the Rhine, and Vespasian had the legions of the Danube and of Asia, which made him more powerful, and he was able to defeat Vitellius on that basis. But it's less certain here as to which one of the candidates has the larger number of.
Well, all right, let's do it on the basis of geography. Upper Midwest, Southwest, a rising part of the economy of the U.S. with all those Californians moving to Arizona. Upper Midwest, Minnesota, in the news because of the Floyd tragedy, but also it represents swing votes influencing Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan. And then the mid-Atlantic state. Can you choose on the basis of geography as opposed to legions?
You might. It depends on whether one of the candidates can bring in more than one state. The significance of Shapiro is that his state is absolutely vital, but it's just one state. And there's a broader regional, I think, appeal to the other two in terms of having more than one state that they can influence. And of course, the second factor in the year of the 4 emperors, which is just as critical here in our year of 5 emperors, is the ingratiating part. And it really is important that the 5th emperor be able to bring some measure of appeal and some ability to promise. This was, for example, what Al Gore was able to do for Mr. Clinton in '92.
Well, that means Kelly, astronaut, husband of a
Right.
murdered congresswoman,
Right.
presenting Arizona, military. That's glamour.
But Arizona's less in play than Pennsylvania, correct?
All three are good.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm just going for the celebrity part. Walz is senior, Shapiro is junior, and they're not known outside of their states. They're not national figures yet. They'd have to be because they're going to campaign on their own. Kelly, everybody knows what an astronaut is. Everybody. Plus, he's got a brother, a twin brother, who I think was in space for more than a year as an endurance test. So a lot of good stories. I mean,
well, you need some charisma.
Yeah.
Because of the fragility of the lead emperor, the senior emperor in waiting, Ms. Harris, is not. The manufactured charisma is not going to endure past the convention. So they need some authenticity on the ticket, someone who people can see as more authentic, and that would be Kelly.
And finally, Germanicus, assassination, resignation, going to a vice president with no national experience campaigning, Mr. Trump on the rampage, and then more wars in the Middle East. And the first F-16 arrives in Kyiv, and Mr. Zelensky says, I want more. There's no time to reflect. Germanicus, Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. We're off to sacrifice to Augustus, exhausted as we are by the 21st century. Friends of History Debating Society, I'm John Batchelor.